In April of 1857, a traveling cotton broker from Charleston discovered something that would haunt him until his death 30 years later. While reviewing plantation ledgers at a modest estate called Moss Creek in Middle Georgia, he noticed a peculiar pattern in the sales records. 23 male slaves sold over 15 years, each one fetching prices far above market value, each one accompanied by a notation in the margin: prime condition, certified. What the broker couldn't have known then was that those two words concealed a secret so disturbing that when the truth finally emerged, it would threaten to unravel the carefully constructed lies of Georgia's most prominent families. For decades, local authorities buried the evidence, burned documents, and silenced witnesses. But some secrets refuse to stay buried, especially when they're written in blood and recorded in meticulous detail by a woman who understood that the greatest weapon isn't violence, it's truth. Before we continue with the story of Eleanor Cresswell and the plantation that became a tomb for both bodies and reputations, I need to ask you something. If you're listening from Georgia or anywhere in the South, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're from. And if this introduction has already sent chills down your spine, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about the antebellum South. What the Charleston broker witnessed that spring afternoon was merely the surface of something far deeper. A calculated operation that had been running smoothly since 1841. Moss Creek Plantation occupied 370 acres of Georgia clay soil nestled between the Oconee River and the county road that connected Milledgeville to Augusta. It wasn't among the grand estates that defined Southern aristocracy. No white-columned mansion, no sprawling gardens, no reputation for lavish parties. Instead, Moss Creek was known for its efficiency. The main house was a modest two-story structure built of local timber, functional rather than impressive, surrounded by 12 slave cabins, a cotton gin, a smokehouse, and a barn that locals noted seemed unusually large for a plantation of its size. Eleanor Cresswell had inherited Moss Creek in 1840 when her husband, Thomas, died suddenly of what the doctor listed as apoplexy. She was 31 years old, childless according to public record, and expected by her neighbors to sell the property and move back to Savannah, where her family maintained a respectable shipping business. Instead, she dismissed the overseer her husband had employed, took over the management herself, and within a year had transformed Moss Creek from a struggling operation into one of the most profitable mid-size plantations in the county. She managed this feat through what she called strategic acquisition and disposal. While other planters held onto their slaves for generations, building communities of families who worked the same soil their parents and grandparents had worked, Eleanor treated her workforce like a carefully managed investment portfolio. She would purchase young male slaves at market, keep them for 12 to 18 months, then sell them for substantial profits to planters in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. States where the expanding cotton frontier created endless demand for labor. The women at Moss Creek, never more than 6 or 7 at a time, stayed permanently. They worked the kitchen, the vegetable garden, and the house itself. They were older, past childbearing age, chosen specifically for their inability to reproduce. Eleanor had no interest in raising slave children, no patience for the complications of families. She wanted efficiency, profit, and something else, something her neighbors wouldn't understand until it was far too late. By 1845, Eleanor had developed a reputation as a shrewd businesswoman. Male planters who initially refused to negotiate with a woman found themselves reluctantly impressed by her knowledge of cotton yields, soil management, and market prices. She never socialized, never attended church, never participated in the social rituals that defined Southern womanhood. When pressed about her unwomanly behavior, she would smile, a tight, calculating expression that never reached her eyes, and say that widowhood had freed her from the burden of pretense. What no one knew, what no one could have suspected, was that Eleanor kept 3 separate sets of books. The first was standard plantation accounts, expenses, yields, sales, available for any neighbor or tax assessor to review. The second recorded the actual profits from Moss Creek, numbers significantly higher than those in the official ledger. The third set of books was kept in a locked iron box beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, written in a code she had developed herself, a cipher based on shipping manifests she had learned from her father's business in Savannah. In those coded pages, Eleanor recorded everything: names, dates, physical descriptions, and most importantly, observations that would have meant nothing to a casual reader, but everything to someone who understood what she was building. Next to each name, she noted eye color, hair texture, the shape of a nose, the set of a jaw, the tone of skin under different lighting. She was creating a catalog, a genealogical record that would prove invaluable when the time came to make her accusations. The routine at Moss Creek never varied. When Eleanor purchased a new slave, always male, always between the ages of 18 and 25, always strong and healthy, she would keep him separate from the others for the first week. The other slaves knew what this meant, though they never spoke of it openly, not even among themselves. Some things were too dangerous to voice, even in whispers. On the seventh night, Eleanor would summon the young man to the main house. What happened during those hours remained behind locked doors, but the slaves who worked in the house noticed certain things. They noticed that Eleanor always bathed beforehand, that she wore a specific dress, plain grey cotton, nothing decorative, that she kept a lamp burning in her bedroom until well past midnight. They noticed that the young men who emerged the next morning walked differently, their eyes cast down, their shoulders curved inward as if trying to make themselves smaller. And they noticed that Eleanor the following day would spend hours in her study with the iron box open beside her, writing in her private ledger with the concentration of a clerk recording legal testimony. The first disappearance occurred in the autumn of 1843, though it would be years before anyone connected it to Moss Creek. A slave named Samuel, sold to a cotton planter in Alabama for the remarkable sum of $1,800, never arrived at his destination. The buyer sent an angry letter to Eleanor demanding either the slave or a refund. Eleanor responded with copies of the bill of sale, a signed receipt from the driver who had transported Samuel, and a polite expression of concern. The matter was dropped. Slaves ran away, everyone knew that. Perhaps Samuel had seized his chance for freedom during the journey west. 6 months later, another man sold by Eleanor, this one named Isaac, purchased by a planter in Mississippi, similarly vanished between Georgia and his destination. Again, Eleanor produced impeccable documentation. Again, the buyer grudgingly accepted the loss. The odds of 2 slaves from the same small plantation successfully escaping seemed unlikely, but not impossible. By 1847, 5 men sold by Moss Creek had disappeared without a trace. The pattern should have raised alarms, but it didn't. The buyers were scattered across 3 states. Communication between planters was sporadic, and Eleanor's reputation for honest dealing remained untarnished. She always provided documentation, always expressed appropriate concern, always suggested that the men had likely fled at the first opportunity. In a system built on the premise that enslaved people constantly sought freedom, her explanation was not just believable, it was expected. What no one knew was that none of those men had ever left Georgia. Their bodies lay in unmarked graves on Moss Creek land, buried in a section of the property where the soil was rocky and unsuitable for cotton, where Eleanor had told her field hands never to plow because she intended to plant an orchard there someday. The orchard never materialized, but the section of land remained undisturbed, slowly filling with the dead. The killings followed a pattern as precise as everything else Eleanor did. After completing her ritual with each young man, after recording her observations in the coded ledger, she would wait. She would treat the man well during his remaining months at Moss Creek, ensuring he gained weight and muscle, making him more valuable at market. She would have him examined by a doctor, who would certify him as being in prime physical condition. She would arrange the sale, always to a buyer at least 300 miles away, always through intermediaries who handled the transportation. And then, 3 days before the scheduled departure, she would summon him to the barn after dark. The barn that neighbors noted was unusually large. The barn where Eleanor kept not just equipment and hay, but a small room at the back, accessible only through a door she kept locked. In that room she would offer him a drink, whiskey, she said, a rare treat before the long journey ahead. The whiskey was laced with laudanum, enough to make him drowsy but not enough to render him unconscious. She needed him aware for what came next. She needed him to understand. Eleanor would show him the ledger. She would explain, in calm and measured tones, exactly what she had documented. She would tell him about the physical characteristics she had noted, the ones that matched men he had never met, men whose names meant nothing to him. And then she would explain what she planned to do with that information, how she intended to use it to destroy families, to expose hypocrisy, to bring down the very structure of Southern society. She would watch his face as comprehension dawned, as he understood that he had been chosen not for his strength or his youth, but because he possessed certain features that Eleanor had been searching for, features that marked him as valuable not for labor, but for evidence. And then, as the laudanum pulled him deeper into stupor, she would call for the only person at Moss Creek who knew the full extent of her plans, the only person she trusted with her secrets, the only person who shared her hatred for the system that had created places like Moss Creek. Her son would emerge from the shadows of the barn, and together they would complete the work they had begun years ago. Henry Cresswell was not supposed to exist. According to every public record, every census document, every church registry, Eleanor and Thomas Cresswell had remained childless throughout their 12-year marriage. This was true. What the records didn't show was that Eleanor had given birth to a son in 1829, 7 years before her marriage, when she was 20 years old and unmarried, a scandal that would have destroyed her family's reputation in Savannah's tight-knit merchant society. The father was a man her own father would never have accepted, could never have acknowledged. The child was sent north before his first birthday, placed with Eleanor's maternal aunt in Philadelphia, a widow who agreed to raise the boy as her adopted son. Eleanor visited once a year, always in winter when travel between Georgia and Pennsylvania could be explained as family obligation. Henry grew up knowing who his mother was, but understanding that he could never claim her publicly, never call her anything but Aunt Eleanor when others might hear. He also grew up knowing what his father had been, a slave on a Savannah dock, a man who loaded ships for Eleanor's father, a man whose intelligence and quiet dignity had attracted young Eleanor's attention during a summer when she was rebellious and her parents were distracted by business concerns. A man who had been sold away the moment her pregnancy became impossible to hide, sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana where the life expectancy for field hands was measured in years, not decades. Eleanor never saw him again. She learned through careful inquiry years later that he had died in 1835, worked to death in cane fields, his body dumped in an unmarked grave like refuse. That knowledge had crystallized something inside her, transformed her grief and rage into something colder and more dangerous, a plan that would take decades to execute, but would burn down everything the men who had destroyed her life held sacred. Henry returned to Georgia in 1841, 1 year after Thomas Cresswell's death. He arrived not as Eleanor's son, but as Henry Lowell, a traveling merchant specializing in farm equipment, a respectable businessman from Philadelphia with legitimate credentials and an excellent reputation. He stayed at boarding houses in Milledgeville and Augusta, made regular business trips through Middle Georgia, and occasionally visited Moss Creek to discuss equipment purchases with the efficient widow Cresswell. No one suspected that those visits sometimes lasted for days, that Henry had his own room in the main house, that he and Eleanor spent long evenings reviewing the coded ledger and planning their next moves. No one suspected that the unusually large barn contained not just a locked room, but a hidden cellar accessible through a trap door beneath the hay, a cellar where certain implements were kept, where certain tasks were completed that required absolute privacy. The selection process was meticulous. Eleanor didn't choose victims randomly. Each man she purchased had been carefully researched beforehand. She would visit markets in Savannah, Augusta, and Milledgeville, examining young male slaves with the attention to detail of a horse breeder studying bloodlines. But she wasn't looking at teeth or muscle tone, she was looking at faces. She had spent years compiling information about Georgia's prominent families, learning their histories, studying their genealogies, and most importantly, identifying their secrets. She knew which planters had fathered children with enslaved women, knew which families had carefully concealed mixed-race branches, knew which men maintained discreet second households with slave mistresses. She knew these things because wealthy men were rarely discreet about their indiscretions, because slaves who worked in great houses talked among themselves, because information flowed through networks that white society never imagined existed. When Eleanor found a young slave whose features matched those of a prominent family, the distinctive Rutledge nose, the Pemberton jaw, the unusual gray-green eyes that marked the Caldwell line, she would purchase him regardless of cost. She would bring him to Moss Creek, complete her ritual and record every detail that might prove paternity. Eye color, hair texture, skin tone in different lighting, the shape of ears, the patterns of freckles or birthmarks, everything that might convince a jury, should it ever come to that. But Eleanor wasn't interested in legal proceedings. She understood Southern justice well enough to know that no court would side with her against the families she intended to expose. Her weapon wasn't the law, it was shame. She was compiling evidence that would force proud families to confront truths they had spent generations denying. Evidence that would reveal the hypocrisy at the heart of a system that defined humanity by race, while those who enforced that system routinely crossed the boundaries they claimed were sacred. The men she chose became living proof of that hypocrisy. And then, because living proof could be questioned, could deny or distort the truth, could be moved beyond her reach, they became dead proof. Bodies that could be exhumed if necessary. Bones that could be measured, evidence that couldn't lie or flee or refuse to testify. By 1850, 13 men lay buried in the uncultivated section of Moss Creek, 13 sets of measurements in Eleanor's coded ledger, 13 families marked for destruction whenever Eleanor decided the time was right to reveal what she knew. But something was shifting. The country was changing, tensions between North and South were escalating. The Compromise of 1850 had temporarily eased conflicts over slavery's expansion, but everyone sensed that the peace was fragile, that larger confrontations loomed ahead. Eleanor began to wonder if her carefully constructed plan would ever reach fruition, if the war that seemed increasingly inevitable would destroy not just the South, but her ability to make her accusations heard. And then, in the summer of 1856, an opportunity presented itself that would change everything, that would force Eleanor to accelerate her timeline and take risks she had never intended. A letter arrived at Moss Creek from Boston. It was addressed to Widow Cresswell and signed by a man named Daniel Harrington, who identified himself as a lawyer and correspondent for an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. He had heard, through sources he didn't specify, about certain irregularities at her plantation. He had questions about her business practices, about the unusual turnover in her workforce, about the men who had disappeared after being sold. He would be traveling through Georgia in September and hoped to call upon her to discuss these matters. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her hands perfectly steady, her expression revealing nothing. Then she called for Henry, who happened to be visiting that week, and showed him the message. "Someone has been talking," she said quietly. "Someone knows more than they should." Henry studied the letter, his face, so like his father's, according to Eleanor's memories, drawn with concern. "Do we stop?" he asked. "Go quiet until he loses interest?" Eleanor smiled, that tight smile, the one that never reached her eyes. "No," she said. "We invite him to visit. We show him exactly what he expects to see, a successful plantation operated by a competent widow, and then we determine who sent him and what they actually know." What Eleanor didn't yet realize was that Daniel Harrington's letter wasn't the beginning of her problems. It was the harbinger of something far more dangerous. A convergence of circumstances that would force all her secrets into the light far sooner than she had ever planned. If you're still listening, if this story has gripped you with its dark revelations, do something for me right now. Hit that like button and leave a comment with your theory. Do you think Eleanor's plan was justice or madness? Was she fighting a corrupt system or becoming as monstrous as the institution she hated? Share your thoughts below and make sure you're subscribed, because this story is about to take turns you won't see coming. Let's find out what happened when the lawyer from Boston arrived at Moss Creek. The letter had come through channels that should have been secure. Someone in Eleanor's network, the network of information that flowed between slaves, between households, between plantations, had betrayed her. Someone had carried stories north, had whispered about Moss Creek to abolitionists who were always hungry for evidence of Southern cruelty. Daniel Harrington arrived at Moss Creek on September 15th, 1856, traveling in a modest carriage he had hired in Milledgeville. He was 42 years old, thin and angular, with the pale complexion of a man who spent most of his time indoors reviewing legal documents. He wore a dark suit that marked him immediately as a northerner. The cut was wrong, the fabric too heavy for Georgia heat. When he stepped down from the carriage and removed his hat to wipe his forehead, Eleanor noticed his hands were ink-stained, and his collar was slightly frayed. A working lawyer, then, not one of the wealthy abolitionists who funded the movement from comfortable Boston parlors. Eleanor received him in the front parlor, a room she kept meticulously clean but deliberately modest. No expensive furniture, no ornate decorations. Nothing that would suggest Moss Creek was more profitable than her official accounts indicated. She served him cool water and listened patiently as he explained his purpose. "Mrs. Cresswell," he began, his Boston accent marking every word. "I'll be direct with you. I've received communications from individuals who claim that your plantation operates under unusual circumstances. Specifically, that you maintain an all-male workforce, that these men are sold after short periods of time, and that several have disappeared during transport." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "You've been misinformed, Mr. Harrington. I maintain a small workforce of women who handle domestic duties. The men I purchase are kept for 12 to 18 months, during which time I invest in their health and training, then sold at profit to planters in expanding territories. As for disappearances, I can only assume you're referring to men who chose to flee rather than be transported to new locations. I provide all buyers with proper documentation and certified health assessments. If slaves choose to escape, that reflects their desperation, not my practices." Harrington pulled a notebook from his coat pocket. "I have 5 documented cases of men sold by you who never reached their destinations, 5 men who vanished without trace in a period of 12 years. That seems statistically significant." "It seems," Eleanor replied coolly, "like a lawyer from Boston is seeing patterns that don't exist because he wants them to exist. You've come here hoping to find evidence of cruelty, Mr. Harrington. Something dramatic to report to your abolitionist friends, but you won't find it. Moss Creek is a business, operated efficiently and legally. Nothing more. Then you won't mind if I remain in the area for a few days? Interview some of your neighbors, perhaps speak with the slaves who work here?" Eleanor's expression didn't change. "You're welcome to waste your time however you choose. My neighbors will tell you I'm a competent businesswoman who has improved a failing plantation. As for interviewing my slaves, you know as well as I do that their testimony would be worthless in any legal proceeding. They'll tell you whatever they think you want to hear. Nevertheless, I'd like to try." Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt. "Then I won't stop you. Though I should warn you that your presence here, asking questions, spreading northern ideas, it won't be appreciated. Georgia isn't Boston, Mr. Harrington. People here protect their own, and they don't take kindly to outside interference. It wasn't a threat exactly, more like a statement of fact. But Harrington heard the warning underneath, and when he left Moss Creek that afternoon, he was already uncertain about his investigation. Eleanor had been too calm, too prepared. She had answered every question smoothly, had offered to provide documentation for every claim. She had been exactly what she claimed to be, a competent businesswoman operating a legal plantation. But Harrington hadn't survived as an abolitionist lawyer by accepting surface appearances. He took a room at a boarding house in Milledgeville and spent the next 3 days quietly gathering information. He spoke with merchants who had done business with Moss Creek, with other planters who knew Eleanor, with the doctor who certified the health of her slaves before sale. Everyone told the same story. Eleanor Cresswell was unusual, a woman managing a plantation alone, but scrupulously honest in her dealings. On his 4th day in Milledgeville, Harrington received an unexpected visitor, a woman, elderly and black, who came to his boarding house after dark and asked to speak with him privately. She was one of the house slaves at Moss Creek, she said. Her name was Ruth, and she had worked there since Eleanor's husband was alive. She had information about the plantation, about things that happened there, things that no one outside Moss Creek knew. Harrington invited her into his room, offered her the only chair, and listened as Ruth spoke in hushed, urgent tones. She told him about the young men Eleanor purchased, about the ritual of the 7th night, about the unusual amount of time Eleanor spent in her study recording information in ledgers that no one else was allowed to see. She told him about the barn, about the locked room at the back, about how sometimes late at night she had heard sounds coming from that direction, sounds that frightened her, though she couldn't say exactly why. "She ain't right," Ruth said, her weathered hands twisted together in her lap. "Something wrong with Mrs. Eleanor, been wrong since Mr. Thomas died. Maybe before. She got a coldness in her, a planning kind of coldness. And them young men she buys, they don't all get sold away like she claims. Some of them, they just vanish one night, and we never see them again. Do you know what happens to them?" Harrington asked, leaning forward. Ruth shook her head. "No one says it out loud. But there's a part of the property where she don't let nobody work, so she's going to plant an orchard there someday. Ground's been dug up and filled in more than once. And I've seen her and that man." She stopped abruptly as if she'd said too much. "What man?" Harrington pressed. "The equipment man. Mr. Lowell, he calls himself. He comes by regular, stays sometimes for days. Mrs. Eleanor, she says he's selling her farm equipment, but I ain't never seen much new equipment arrive. What I have seen is them two talking late into the night, looking at her books, planning something." Ruth stood to leave, glancing nervously at the door. "I shouldn't have come. If she finds out I talked to you, I don't know what she'll do, but someone needs to know. Something evil happening at Moss Creek, Mr. Harrington, something that needs to stop." After Ruth left, Harrington sat in the darkness of his room, trying to make sense of what he'd heard. If Ruth was telling the truth, then Eleanor wasn't just running an unusual plantation, she was concealing something criminal. The question was what exactly, and more importantly, how could he prove it? The next morning, Harrington hired a horse and rode back to Moss Creek. He hadn't sent word of his visit, hoping to catch Eleanor unprepared. But when he arrived, he found her in the front yard, supervising the loading of cotton bales onto a wagon, completely unfazed by his appearance. "Mr. Harrington," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Back so soon? I thought you'd have finished your investigation by now." "I'd like to see your property," he said. "The entire property, including the outbuildings." Eleanor's smile tightened slightly, but her voice remained pleasant. "Of course. Though I'm not sure what you expect to find, Moss Creek isn't particularly interesting." She gave him a tour, showing him the cotton gin, the smokehouse, the slave cabins. Everything was exactly as one would expect on a small plantation, functional, well-maintained, unremarkable. When they reached the barn, Eleanor opened the main doors wide, showing him the space where equipment was stored, where hay was kept for the mule and horses. "And the back room?" Harrington asked. "I notice there's a door in the rear." "Storage," Eleanor said. "Old tools, broken equipment I haven't gotten around to repairing or discarding. Nothing of interest. I'd like to see it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and Harrington saw something flicker in her eyes. Not fear, but calculation. She was deciding something, weighing options. "Very well," she said finally. She produced a key from her pocket and unlocked the door. The room was exactly as she described, cluttered with old tools, broken plow blades, coils of rope, empty barrels. Dust lay thick on everything, and cobwebs stretched across the corners. It looked like a space that hadn't been used in years. Harrington walked through it slowly, examining everything, looking for something that might confirm Ruth's suspicions. But there was nothing. No evidence of violence, no signs of recent activity, nothing that suggested this room was anything other than forgotten storage. Satisfied, Eleanor asked from the doorway. Harrington turned to face her, frustrated and uncertain. Everything Ruth had told him seemed plausible, but he had no proof, nothing concrete he could take to authorities or publish in the Liberator. Without evidence, he was just another abolitionist making wild accusations about Southern planters. "For now," he said. But as they walked back toward the main house, Harrington noticed something odd. The ground near the barn was uneven in places, subtle depressions and rises that suggested the earth had been disturbed at some point. He remembered Ruth's comment about digging and filling. He glanced toward the area she had mentioned, the section where Eleanor claimed she would plant an orchard someday. From a distance, it looked like ordinary uncultivated land, rocky and unsuitable for cotton. But there was something about the way the vegetation grew there, patterns that didn't quite match the surrounding areas. "That section there," he said, pointing. "Why haven't you developed it?" "Poor soil," Eleanor replied immediately. "Too rocky for cotton, and I haven't had time to prepare it properly for an orchard. It's on my list of future improvements." Harrington studied the land, trying to determine if his suspicions were justified or if he was seeing patterns where none existed. Finally, he thanked Eleanor for her time and rode back to Milledgeville, more uncertain than ever about what was happening at Moss Creek. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the room he had just searched was exactly what Eleanor wanted him to see. A carefully prepared false front. The real room, the one where the work was done, lay beneath it. The trap door was concealed under those empty barrels, covered with a layer of dirt and straw, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. And the implements Ruth had heard being used late at night were safely locked in the cellar below, along with 13 carefully labeled wooden boxes that contained detailed records of every man buried in that rocky field. Daniel Harrington spent another week in Georgia, interviewing anyone who would talk to him, searching for evidence that would support Ruth's claims. But everywhere he turned, he found the same story. Eleanor Cresswell was an unusual woman, certainly, but there was no proof of wrongdoing. The sales were properly documented. The buyers confirmed receiving their money's worth, at least for the slaves who actually arrived. The disappearances, while suspicious, could be explained by escape attempts. Ruth's testimony, coming from an enslaved woman with no physical evidence to support her claims, would be worthless in any legal proceeding. Frustrated, Harrington finally returned to Boston in early October. He wrote a brief article for the Liberator describing Moss Creek and his suspicions, but without concrete evidence, even his abolitionist allies were reluctant to pursue the matter. The article was published on page 7, buried among other accounts of Southern injustice, and generated little attention. Within a month, the story was forgotten. But Eleanor didn't forget. Harrington's visit had exposed a dangerous weakness in her system. Someone, Ruth obviously, had talked. That meant others might talk as well. It meant her secrets were more vulnerable than she had realized. It meant she needed to accelerate her plans, to move from documentation to action before another investigator came asking questions. The night after she confirmed Harrington had left Georgia, Eleanor summoned Ruth to the main house. The old woman arrived, trembling, knowing somehow that her betrayal had been discovered. Eleanor sat her down in the parlor, poured her a glass of water, and spoke in tones that were almost gentle. "You talked to the lawyer," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Ruth's hands shook so badly she couldn't hold the glass. "Mrs. I'm not going to punish you, Ruth. I understand why you did it. You're frightened. You've seen things you don't understand, and you wanted someone to make it stop. Eleanor leaned forward. But I need you to understand something. What's happening at Moss Creek? It's not what you think. I'm not a monster. I'm not killing those men out of cruelty or madness. I'm building something. A weapon that will destroy the very system that enslaved you, that enslaved your parents, that will enslave your grandchildren if someone doesn't stop it. Ruth stared at her, confused and terrified. I don't understand, Mrs. Eleanor stood and retrieved the iron box from her study. She opened it, showing Ruth the coded ledgers. Every man I've brought to Moss Creek was chosen for a reason. Every one of them carries blood that connects them to Georgia's most powerful families. Blood that proves what hypocrites these people are, what liars, what monsters. I've spent 16 years documenting that proof, creating an archive that will force this state, this entire region, to confront truths they've spent generations denying. She pulled out sketches she had made, detailed drawings showing facial features, measurements, comparisons. Look at this man. His name was Isaac. Look at his eyes, Ruth. Do you know who else has eyes that exact shade of gray-green? Senator Caldwell. I've seen the senator's portrait. I've studied his family. Isaac was his grandson, Ruth, the product of the senator's father raping a slave woman 40 years ago. And Isaac isn't the only one. There are 12 more, all carrying blood that connects them to families who claim their lineage is pure, who build their entire identity on the lie of racial superiority. Ruth's eyes widened with comprehension and horror. And you killed them? I preserved the evidence, Eleanor corrected coldly. Living men can be moved, can be sold again, can disappear into the vast expanse of this country where I could never find them again. Dead men stay where I put them. Dead men can be exhumed. Their bones can be measured, examined, compared. Dead men can't deny what their bodies prove. But Mrs., Ruth whispered, that's murder. That's evil. Eleanor's face hardened. What's evil is the system that created the need for men like Isaac to exist. What's evil is a society that allows wealthy men to rape women they own, to father children they'll never acknowledge, to build empires on the bodies of people they've declared less than human. I'm not the monster here, Ruth, I'm the reckoning. Ruth sat frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. Finally, she asked the question that had been haunting her since Eleanor began this explanation. What about Mr. Lowell? Who is he really? Eleanor smiled, and for the first time there was something like genuine emotion in the expression. He's my son, mine and the property of a man my father once owned. That's why I understand this fight, Ruth. That's why I'll never stop, because my own child exists in a world that would destroy him if they knew the truth about his father. A world that needs to burn. In that moment, Ruth understood that Eleanor was far more dangerous than she had imagined. This wasn't madness. This was something worse. A calculated, multi-decade campaign of revenge that had already claimed 13 lives and showed no signs of stopping. What are you going to do with all this? Ruth asked quietly. When? Soon, Eleanor said. The country is moving toward war. Everyone can feel it. And when that war comes, when the South is weakened and vulnerable, I'll release everything. Every name, every connection, every piece of evidence. I'll mail copies to newspapers in the North and South, to government officials, to churches. I'll make sure the entire nation knows what hypocrites built this system, what lies sustain it. And I'll do it in a way that can't be ignored or suppressed, because the evidence will be irrefutable. She closed the iron box and locked it again. But I need your silence, Ruth. I need you to understand that if you talk again, if you bring anyone else here asking questions, you won't just be endangering me. You'll be destroying the only chance we have to make these people pay for what they've done. Do you understand? Ruth nodded slowly, though inside she felt like she was drowning. She understood, but understanding didn't make it right. 13 men were dead. 13 men who, regardless of whose blood they carried, had been murdered to serve Eleanor's vision of justice. There had to be another way, Ruth thought. There had to be a path that didn't require killing. But she also knew that in 1856 Georgia, no court would accept slave testimony against white families. No newspaper would publish accusations from an enslaved woman. No legal mechanism existed that would allow the truth Eleanor had documented to be heard. In a system built on injustice, Eleanor had concluded that only injustice could bring it down. Ruth left the main house that night carrying a burden she had never asked for, the knowledge of what Moss Creek truly was and the terrible understanding that she was now complicit in whatever came next. Over the following months, Eleanor moved forward with renewed urgency. She purchased 3 more young men between October 1856 and March 1857, each one chosen with even greater care than before. She was no longer building her archive slowly over years. She was racing against time, trying to complete her collection before war came or before another investigator arrived with more resources than Daniel Harrington. Henry made more frequent visits to Moss Creek, sometimes staying for weeks at a time. He had closed his business in Philadelphia, he told acquaintances, and was considering relocating to the South, where opportunities seemed more abundant. No one questioned this. Plenty of Northerners were moving south in those years, drawn by cheap land and the promise of cotton wealth. What they were really doing, mother and son together, was preparing for the endgame. Henry had begun making copies of Eleanor's coded ledgers, translating them into plain English and storing them in different locations. A bank vault in Savannah, a lawyer's office in Charleston, with trusted contacts in Pennsylvania. They were creating redundancy, ensuring that even if Eleanor or her original documents were destroyed, the evidence would survive. They also refined their method. The cellar beneath the barn now contained not just bodies, but detailed anatomical records. Henry had studied medicine for 2 years before abandoning it for commerce, and he brought that knowledge to their work. After each killing, he would take measurements, make sketches, preserve hair samples, and, in some cases, remove specific bones that showed distinctive family traits. It was grisly work, but Henry approached it with clinical detachment. These weren't people to him. They were evidence in a case that would reshape history. By the spring of 1857, Eleanor's archive documented connections to 17 prominent Georgia families, 17 senators, judges, plantation owners, and merchants whose carefully maintained family trees concealed branches they would never acknowledge. 17 men whose political power and social standing rested on the lie that their bloodlines were pure. Eleanor estimated she needed evidence connecting to at least 25 families before she would have enough leverage to create the cascade effect she wanted, where the exposure of one family would lead to questions about others, where the scandal would spread like fire through the interconnected web of Georgia's elite. She was close. Perhaps one more year of work, one more handful of carefully selected men, and she would have everything she needed. But fate, as it often does, had different plans. In April of 1857, the Charleston cotton broker arrived at Moss Creek to review her ledgers, and in those ledgers he noticed the pattern that would begin Eleanor's unraveling. The broker's name was William Thorne, and he was meticulous in a way that Eleanor hadn't anticipated. Most buyers reviewed plantation accounts looking only at bottom-line numbers, production costs, sale prices, profit margins. Thorne examined everything. He noticed that every male slave Eleanor sold fetched prices significantly above market average. He noticed the notation, "prime condition certified," appeared with suspicious consistency. And most damning, he noticed that several of the men listed as sold never appeared in subsequent records from their supposed buyers. Thorne was curious rather than suspicious. He assumed there was a reasonable explanation. Perhaps Eleanor had connections with specific buyers who valued her slaves highly. Perhaps there was some training or preparation she provided that justified the premium prices. He mentioned his observations casually, expecting Eleanor to explain the pattern. Instead, he saw something flash across her face, just for a moment, just a fraction of a second, that made his professional instincts prickle with alarm. It was fear, carefully concealed, instantly suppressed, but unmistakable. Eleanor Cresswell was afraid of what he had noticed. Thorne left Moss Creek that afternoon planning to make discreet inquiries. If something irregular was happening, if Eleanor was somehow manipulating her records or engaging in fraud, he had a professional obligation to investigate. More importantly, he had relationships with several of the planters listed as buyers in her ledgers. He could verify whether the slaves had actually been received, whether the transactions were legitimate. Eleanor watched his carriage disappear down the road and immediately sent word to Henry in Milledgeville. They met that night in the main house, and for the first time in 16 years, Eleanor felt genuine panic. "He's going to check," she said, pacing the study. "He's going to contact the buyers and discover the men never arrived. And then he's going to come back with authorities, or he's going to spread word, and everything will unravel before we're ready." Henry stood by the window, his face reflecting in the dark glass. "We stop now," he said quietly. "We take what we have, 17 families, enough to cause significant damage, and we release it. Mail the copies tomorrow, send them everywhere we planned. It won't be perfect, but it will be enough." "It won't," Eleanor insisted. 17 isn't enough to create the cascade we need. They'll suppress it. They'll find ways to discredit the evidence, to claim the documents are forgeries, to murder anyone who tries to investigate. We need more. We need enough connections that they can't possibly contain the scandal." "Then what do you propose?" Eleanor stopped pacing. Her hands, which had been trembling moments before, steadied themselves. When she spoke, her voice carried the cold certainty that had guided her through 16 years of patient work. "We eliminate the problem. Thorne has noticed, but he hasn't told anyone yet. He's going to make inquiries first, verify his suspicions before making accusations. That gives us a window. A few days, perhaps a week." Henry turned from the window, his expression troubled. "You're talking about killing a white man, a respectable businessman from Charleston. That's completely different from what we've been doing. The slaves, no one investigates when slaves disappear. But this, they'll hunt whoever did it. They'll tear this county apart, looking for answers. They'll hunt a runaway slave," Eleanor said. "They'll hunt someone who attacked Thorne during a robbery. They'll hunt whoever we tell them to hunt. But they won't suspect me. Wealthy white men don't suspect respectable widows of murder." Over the next 2 days, Eleanor and Henry refined their plan. They learned that Thorne was staying at the Milledgeville Hotel, that he planned to spend the week visiting plantations in the area and meeting with potential clients. He was a creature of habit, Thorne. He took the same walk every evening after dinner, a constitutional along the quiet road that led to the river. He walked alone, carrying a small pistol for protection, but generally unconcerned about danger. Milledgeville was civilized, he believed, not like the rougher territories where one needed to fear violence. On April 23rd, as the sun set and Thorne began his evening walk, a figure approached him from behind. The figure wore clothes stolen from Eleanor's property, the rough work clothes of a field hand. His face was partially obscured by a hat pulled low. He moved with the desperate urgency of someone who had nothing left to lose. What happened next would be reported in the Milledgeville newspaper as a tragic robbery. William Thorne, respected broker from Charleston, was attacked on the river road by what witnesses described as a large male slave, possibly an escapee from a nearby plantation. Thorne's pistol was fired once, but the shot went wild. He was struck repeatedly with a blunt object, later determined to be a section of wood, possibly a tree branch. His skull was fractured in 3 places. He died within minutes. His money and pocket watch were missing, taken presumably by his attacker. But curiously, his leather satchel containing business documents was left at the scene, its contents untouched. This detail struck some as odd. Why would a thief take only money and ignore valuable papers? But in the panic following the murder, the question was overlooked. A massive manhunt was organized. Every plantation within 20 miles was searched for missing slaves. Patrols scoured the countryside for days, convinced the killer must still be in the area. They found nothing. No missing slaves were reported. No witnesses came forward with useful information. The investigation eventually went cold, another unsolved tragedy in a region where violence was common enough that people eventually stopped asking questions. What no one knew, what no one even suspected, was that the man who killed William Thorne hadn't fled at all. He had returned to Moss Creek, removed the stolen clothes in the cellar beneath the barn, washed away the blood, and resumed his identity as Henry Lowell, respectable merchant from Philadelphia. By the time the manhunt began, he was sitting in Eleanor's parlor, calmly discussing cotton prices with a neighbor who had stopped by to pay his respects to the widow. The murder bought Eleanor time, but it also changed something fundamental in their operation. Killing the slaves had been, in Eleanor's mind, a necessary evil in service of a greater good. They were casualties in a war against an unjust system, sacrifices that would ultimately free thousands. But Thorne was different. Thorne was innocent of the system's original crimes. He was simply a man who had noticed something odd and asked questions. His death wasn't justice. It was simply murder to protect their secret. Henry felt it too. In the weeks following Thorne's death, he became quieter, more withdrawn. He still helped Eleanor with her work, still participated in their plans, but something had shifted in him. The absolute certainty that had sustained them for 16 years had developed cracks. Just when we thought the horror at Moss Creek couldn't possibly get darker, we discover that Eleanor and Henry have crossed a line that changes everything. Their mission of exposing hypocrisy has become exactly the kind of evil they claim to oppose. If this story is giving you chills, if you're questioning whether justice can ever be achieved through such terrible means, share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button if you want to support content that explores the complicated truths hidden in our past. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the shocking conclusion. Because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about Eleanor's plan. The real consequence of Thorne's murder wasn't legal. Eleanor and Henry were never suspects. The real consequence was that it forced Eleanor to confront an uncomfortable truth. Her crusade against injustice had made her capable of any atrocity if she believed it served her greater purpose. She had become exactly what she hated. Someone willing to destroy individual lives to protect a system. In her case, the system of revenge she had built over 16 years. The answer to what really happened at Moss Creek emerged not through investigation or exposure, but through an accident of history. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, Georgia was convulsed by the conflict. Plantations were abandoned, burned, or seized. Records were destroyed. The social order that had sustained places like Moss Creek for generations collapsed in the span of 4 years. Eleanor Cresswell died in 1863, killed not by justice or exposure but by pneumonia. She was 54 years old, and according to her neighbors, died peacefully in her sleep. She never released her archive. The war she had hoped would create conditions for her revelation instead consumed everything. Her carefully documented evidence remained locked in the iron box beneath her floorboards, coded and inaccessible. Henry disappeared sometime in 1864. One day he simply wasn't in Milledgeville anymore. Some said he'd returned north. Others that he'd been killed in one of the random acts of violence that characterized the war's final years. His actual fate remains unknown. The copies of Eleanor's ledgers he had stored in various locations were lost in the chaos. The bank in Savannah was burned, the lawyer in Charleston died, the contacts in Pennsylvania moved or perished during the war years. Moss Creek itself was abandoned in 1865. With Eleanor dead and no clear heir, the property reverted to the state. Various people occupied it over the following decades, but none stayed long. The house fell into disrepair. The fields returned to wilderness. The barn, that unusually large barn, collapsed in a storm in 1871. The bodies in the rocky section where Eleanor had planned to plant an orchard remained undiscovered for 37 years. In 1902, a developer purchased the Moss Creek property planning to build a school. During excavation, workers uncovered the first skeleton, then another, then several more. Eventually, they found 16 bodies buried in shallow graves, along with wooden boxes containing hair samples, sketches, and measurements. The discovery created a sensation in Georgia. Newspapers ran stories speculating about what had happened, who the victims were, why they had been buried there. But with Eleanor dead for nearly 40 years, with slavery abolished, and most of the prominent families from her era either dead or diminished, there was no one to prosecute, no clear narrative to explain the horror that had been unearthed. The iron box was found during the demolition of the main house. A construction worker discovered it beneath rotten floorboards and, curious about its contents, broke the lock. Inside, he found ledgers written in code that no one could decipher, sketches of faces, detailed measurements, and notations that seemed to indicate some kind of breeding or genealogical research. He turned the box over to local authorities, who examined it briefly before storing it in a courthouse basement. No one could make sense of Eleanor's cipher, and eventually the documents were forgotten again. It wasn't until 1957, exactly 100 years after William Thorne's murder, that a graduate student researching antebellum Georgia for his dissertation stumbled across the iron box in courthouse archives. The student, intrigued by the coded ledgers, spent 2 years working to break Eleanor's cipher. When he finally succeeded, what he discovered was so disturbing that his dissertation committee initially refused to accept his findings as credible. But the evidence was there, meticulous and damning. Eleanor had documented 17 connections between enslaved men and prominent white families. She had recorded dates, physical characteristics, family histories. And most chilling, she had noted which men had been preserved for evidence, her euphemism for murder. The student's dissertation, published in 1959, created a minor scandal in academic circles, but received little public attention. The families Eleanor had targeted were mostly extinct, or no longer politically powerful. The specific individuals she had murdered were unnamed in her ledgers, identified only by coded designations. Without names, without living victims to mourn, the story failed to generate the outrage Eleanor had imagined it would. What her archive did prove, what her decades of careful documentation demonstrated beyond doubt, was that the racial boundaries Southern society had claimed were sacred and inviolable were, in fact, routinely crossed by the very men who defended them most vigorously. The hypocrisy Eleanor had devoted her life to exposing was real. Her evidence was irrefutable. But by the time it came to light, the world had changed so much that the revelations no longer had the power to shock. The question that haunted researchers for decades afterward wasn't whether Eleanor's accusations were true. They clearly were. The question was whether her methods could ever be justified. She had murdered at least 16 people, possibly more. She had manipulated, lied, and calculated every move with cold precision. She had claimed to fight injustice while perpetrating monstrous injustices of her own. Some scholars argued that Eleanor was a product of her time, that the system she fought was so thoroughly evil that extreme measures were the only option available. Others contended that murder could never be justified regardless of motive, that Eleanor's crusade had transformed her into exactly the kind of monster she claimed to oppose. The slaves who survived Moss Creek told conflicting stories. Some remembered Eleanor as cruel but efficient, no worse than other plantation owners. Others, like Ruth, who lived until 1889, spoke of the terror that pervaded the place, the sense that something dark and wrong was always lurking just beneath the surface of everyday routine. Ruth never revealed what Eleanor had told her that night in 1856. She took that knowledge to her grave, perhaps understanding that some secrets were too dangerous to speak aloud even in freedom. The most unsettling aspect of the Moss Creek story is how close Eleanor came to succeeding. If the Civil War hadn't disrupted everything, if she had lived another 5 years, if Thorne hadn't noticed the pattern in her ledgers, she might have released her archive under conditions where it could have caused the devastation she imagined. She might have forced Georgia's elite to confront the lies that sustained their power. She might have used truth as a weapon in ways that would have reshaped Southern society. But history doesn't reward patience, and justice doesn't always arrive when we summon it. Eleanor's elaborate plan, 16 years in the making, ultimately accomplished nothing beyond adding to the body count of an already bloody era. The men she murdered died for evidence that no one would see for a century. The families she sought to destroy collapsed for reasons having nothing to do with her revelations. The system she hated ended not through exposure of its hypocrisy, but through war and political transformation. Today, nothing remains of Moss Creek. The land where the plantation stood is now a shopping center. The rocky field where bodies were buried is a parking lot. A small historical marker notes that the site was once a plantation called Moss Creek, operated by Eleanor Cresswell, but it makes no mention of what happened there. Tourists pass it without stopping, unaware that beneath the asphalt lie the graves of men whose names have been forgotten, whose deaths served a purpose that was never fulfilled. The iron box and its contents are housed in the Georgia Historical Society archives in Savannah. Researchers can request access with proper credentials, though few do. The coded ledgers have been fully translated and digitized, available to anyone curious enough to search the archives. But Eleanor's careful documentation, her years of meticulous work, are now just another obscure historical footnote, interesting to specialists but unknown to the general public. Perhaps that's the cruelest irony of all. Eleanor wanted her evidence to be impossible to ignore, to force the world to confront truths it preferred to deny. Instead, her story became just another forgotten chapter in a history already overflowing with forgotten chapters. The truth she died protecting is now accessible to anyone, but almost no one cares to look. The last question Eleanor's story raises is the most troubling. What do we do with evidence of historical evil that arrives too late to matter? Eleanor proved that Georgia's elite were hypocrites, that the racial boundaries they defended were fictions, that the system of slavery was built on lies even more fundamental than anyone acknowledged. But she proved it a century after it could have changed anything. By the time her archive was decoded, the men she accused were dead, their families diminished, their world already destroyed by forces having nothing to do with her carefully constructed case. Does truth have value if it comes too late for justice? Does documentation of evil matter if no one can be held accountable? These are the questions Moss Creek forces us to confront. And they're questions without comfortable answers. What do you think of Eleanor's story? Was she a woman fighting injustice with the only weapons available to her? Or did she become as monstrous as the system she hated? Could her murders ever be justified by the greater good she claimed to serve? Or does the fact that her plan ultimately failed prove that violence in service of justice always corrupts the cause it claims to advance? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts. If you found this story as disturbing and thought-provoking as I did, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We explore the darkest corners of American history, the stories that make us uncomfortable, the truths that challenge our assumptions about the past. And if you want to discuss this story further, share it with friends who appreciate complex moral questions and historical mysteries. Thanks for listening. See you in the next video.